revolution, and things changed overnight, and it was dramatic and wonderful.
This great revolution was the most important change in all human history.
But there was no such revolution, because the origins of farming had been forming in this country for thousands of years. New research now proves that right from the beginning we did things rather differently. 9,000 years ago, in the Vale of Pickering, Yorkshire, there was a hunting and living site on the edge of a huge post-Ice Age lake. Star Kar was inhabited by humans 4,000 years before the pyramids were built. What was found has made me even more certain that the origins of British farming lay on British soil. Tim Shadler Hall has excavated here.
So we're in the middle of the lake, are we?
Yeah.
Prove it.
Well, I can prove it in all sorts of ways, but this is basically filled with peat. If you stand there,
Ooh.
you can feel the peat.
It's like being on jelly.
It's about 3
meters. Do it again, that was rather good.
It's about
Whoa.
3 metres of peat, which is the whole history of the lake.
That's fantastic. Well, where does it stop?
Stops just as the ground rises, and the site we're going to look at is just beyond there.
Right, let's go for it.
Huge numbers of animal bones were found here, and amongst these were dozens of dog bones.
Now we're actually reaching the level at which all the occupation at Star Kar took place. In fact, we're almost on the site.
Well, there's a lot less bounce here.
Well, there's no bounce at all, because it's hard ground. You know, we've got the lake behind.
Yeah.
We would be coming into a sort of reed swamp.
Yeah.
And then you'd be right through into open water.
Open water.
You've got a perfect landscape. You've got open water, you've got lowland, you've got potentially good grazing, you've got wood, you've got lots of areas where you can find wild animals, and the lake never goes away. They're burning the lake edges in order to encourage animals.
So burning off reed?
Burning off reed, get young shoots, it's perfect for food, it's good for hunting.
I'm very intrigued about the 3 dogs.
Because we've got more dogs now, I think, than anywhere else. They're all dated to about 7,000 BC. They're obviously used for hunting, all of which have been identified as being domesticated dogs rather than European wolves.
Archaeologists have always believed that these dogs were only used for hunting, to chase and retrieve prey. But I believe they were doing quite a lot more than that.
It actually sounds like you're talking about an extremely sophisticated society.
I rather think of them as people adopting the principle of least effort. They're intelligent like us, they do no more than they need to, they have a larder around them, and they're going to just go for it. Their population levels are low enough for them to have a very pleasant life, to exploit the environment, and effectively, in my view, farm it.
I was delighted to find this out at Star Kar. Years of working as a sheep farmer had already convinced me that these prehistoric dogs would have been used not only to hunt, but also to herd prey, just like sheepdogs do today. I got into sheep farming mainly because I got fed up reading accounts of prehistoric farmers written by archaeologists who couldn't tell one end of a sheep from another.
I bought a small farm and started to use ancient techniques. I soon found that it was no good without a dog. If I didn't have a dog, the sheep were running all over the place. But I read in all the textbooks that prehistoric sheep can't be worked by a dog. But my ancient primitive sheep hadn't read the textbooks.
I found that primitive sheep can be worked by a dog. My sheepdog Jess is not very different from the dogs whose remains were found at Star Kar.
Don't forget that border collies are actually descended from wolves like all other dogs. What Jess is doing now is she's rounding up the sheep to bring to me the top dog in her mind to kill. I'll then kill the prey, in her mind, and then I'll throw it to the other wolves in the pack. Now, there isn't a huge difference between what I do with Jess and what the people at Star Car 9,000 years ago would have done with their hunting dogs. Look back! Look back, Jess!
Essentially, we are both manipulating animals for our own use.
Stay there. So the difference in that case between hunting and farming is really remarkably slight.
The dog bones found at Star Car prove that the ancient Britons were managing animals 4,000 years before the so-called farming invasion. Within Cheddar Gorge are some of the oldest caves in Britain. It was here that scientists found something which was to shake the archaeological world. This is where Arthur Goff discovered what is still the oldest complete skeleton in the British Isles. He found it in 1903, and then in the 1980s the bones were radiocarbon dated and were shown to be a staggering 9,000 years old. That's a few centuries after the Ice Age. But the really exciting thing happened in 1997, when these bones, which became known as Cheddar Man, were analysed for mitochondrial DNA by Oxford University. Unlike regular DNA that combines genetic matter from both male and female parents, mitochondrial DNA is only inherited through the female line.
Mitochondrial DNA you only get from your mother. So I got mine from my mother, who got it from her mother, who got it from her mother, who got it from her mother. So there's an unbroken line stretching way back into the past.
Because this mitochondrial DNA changes very little over the generations, it's an excellent way of tracing origins. Sykes has used it to track the origins of the main populations of Europe.
Mitochondrial DNA were once bacteria that were free-living and then millions of years ago got into cells and then allowed cells to use oxygen, and they're still there. So they have a separate kind of history from the nuclear chromosomes, and it's that which gives us this really good way of tracking back through the maternal line.
What astounded the archaeological world was that Cheddar Man's DNA was identical to that of a number of people living in the local area today.
It brought home the point that it was almost exactly the same as somebody living in the same village. So the DNA from those really old specimens, and Cheddar Man 9,000 years old, is identical to the DNA in people living in Britain now.
This set the archaeological world twittering, because the textbook said that the native Ice Age inhabitants had all been driven away by waves of people coming from the continent who brought with them farming.
If the hunter-gatherers had been swept away by the incoming farmers, then you would expect the DNA from pre-farming skeletons to be very different to the present day. Well, we showed farmers hadn't replaced the population that was there previously. We're carrying, if you like, the history of our species around with us. When we realise we've got the real stuff that they carry around in their own bodies with us today, I think that's an insight which I hadn't contemplated or expected.
If Sykes was right, then the Ice Age people survived, and their culture survived as well. And it's that which fascinates me. Crops, livestock and ideas were introduced to this country from the Near East. But this wasn't a violent invasion. The people of Britain had been managing animals in their own particular way for thousands of years. It was the remains of their unique farming system which had appeared in those aerial photos of Flag Fen.
These dark marks are the remains of an ancient landscape. Now, if you were driving along this road here and you looked out of your car window, you wouldn't see a thing because the ground would be completely flat. What you see from the air are the roots of the crops going down and tapping into the water below the ground.
The plants grow more vigorously over the ancient ditches and show up as darker lines from the air.
One of the most interesting is a pair of ditches over here. Now, those ditches, you now realize, went on either side of a droveway, which is a highly sophisticated form of trackway for moving large numbers of animals from one part of the farm to the other.
This is essential for farming. Today, we rely on barbed wire and electric fences. But the ancient British farmers had designed something that did the work of all of this equipment.
This is a droveway, and it's reconstructed exactly as it would have been in the Bronze Age, with ditches and hedges on either side. Now, it was intended to drive animals, hundreds of them, from one part of the farm to another. And it was in use for about 1,000 years, so it must have worked really well.
There are field systems like this right across Britain, but they are nowhere to be found on the continent. It was a truly British invention.
The unique style of farming in Britain gives us a special opportunity to understand how society was organized. Now, essentially, everything was small scale and based on cooperation between the different farming families. It was in nobody's interest to have large-scale confrontation. And until the 6th centuries or so before the coming of the Romans, there were no kings, princes, or powerful controlling elites. Those are the Great Orme Bronze Age copper mines, and this has to be the maddest way to view an archaeological site.
This railway was built in Victorian times. The mine down there is from a far earlier industrial age. It was discovered in North Wales on the peninsula of Great Orme. The introduction and use of bronze around 2500 BC had a colossal impact. This was the first true age of metal. Bronze is strong but very malleable. These new implements were capable of so much more than the tools of the Stone Age. This really was Britain's first industrial revolution. People always thought that these huge mines were Roman. In actual fact, work began on this great open shaft nearly 4,000 years ago. It's mind-boggling to conceive of how these ancient Britons set about such a vast and complex task.
So, Sean, what exactly is it that you get out of the ground to get copper?
It's malachite, copper carbonate, and that's what they find, and they eventually have to smelt it in to make the pure copper. There are about 6 stages that take it from the solid rock that you see here to finally create the finished product.
I've read they use bone tools as well.
This is a limb bone from a cow. It's one of the 30,000 found throughout the whole mine. You can see it's nicely shaped on the side, used to chisel out the malachite. And it's absorbed the lovely colour as well. And basically, the greener they are, the older they are. This one itself is probably about 3,500 years old. Obviously, lots of the rock is so hard that you have to use stone hammers, like the one here, to actually break it up. This would be a beach stone, and it's granite, and you can see very rough on the edges there, which actually has been used to chisel out the malachite. This is the Great Open Cast, where they started their mining, 1860 BC. They got the easier copper on the surface, and as it became more scarce, were forced to dig further and further down. And finally, they cut into the side of the cliff, making the tunnels.